Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here today.
Great.
So I am going to okay. So I have loved coming back here year after year, and I have some new information and also sharing some tried but true information about what are EMFs, what is wireless, what can you do to protect yourself, and basically the basics of what you need to know about this really important issue, which I came to now about 13 years ago when once upon a time when I believed that wireless was safe, and I'd gotten my first cell phone actually for safety. I was pregnant and had a car that broke down all the time, and cell phones were new. I didn't have one, and thought this was the time to get one. However, what I've learned since then is that cell phones came on the market without pre-market safety testing as there should have been done. Cell towers, all these networks, now we have 5G and the Internet of Things, and all of it represents an environmental health issue that really requires our highest regard to address. So I hope that you will uh, ask questions, be interested in this issue, learn more after I speak. I know there are others who are speaking about this issue. And you can also contact me at Environmental Health Sciences. So let me share my screen. So what are electromagnetic fields? Electromagnetic fields are invisible waves of energy, electric and magnetic fields, and they travel at the speed of light. Our bodies are exquisitely sensitive to electromagnetic fields because we actually operate, our bodies, the systems in our bodies, our cells operate through bioelectric signals. Our heartbeat, our nerve impulses, our communication relies on electrical charges. And what has happened is there are artificial electromagnetic fields that have been introduced with electricity and wireless, which are interfering with our biology. Our brain is uniquely sensitive to electromagnetic fields and is also considered a target organ, as a lot of research has demonstrated, of which I'm going to briefly talk about. But first, I want to start with talking about what are natural electromagnetic fields, because humans and all living things on Earth have evolved under natural electromagnetic fields, ionizing and non-ionizing, between sunlight, the Schumann resonances, cosmic microwaves, lightning. And in the late 1800s came electricity. These are artificial electromagnetic fields. Then came the wireless revolution. And now our lives are saturated with artificially generated electromagnetic fields, be it from electricity, power lines, cell phones, cell towers, 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi, basically anything wireless. And these are machine-made frequencies. You can call them non-native, as I've heard them being referred to, or synthetic, or man-made, or artificial, but they are not natural. And they are not the same as the natural electromagnetic fields that we evolved in. They are actually quite complex signals. Now, when this issue is raised, you'll often hear, and it's written in reports by industry and by governments, that look, the kind of electromagnetic fields you're talking about, they're non-ionizing. When we talk about power lines or electricity, or basically everything here on the electromagnetic spectrum. And because it's non-ionizing and not the same as X-rays or nuclear radiation or atomic bombs, they say that it's completely safe. So we hear this over and over again, but the ionizing versus non-ionizing paradigm is an outdated approach. It, it does not address the health and environmental issues, which we're going to talk about. So, there can be harm to living beings from exposures which are non-ionizing. In fact, if you think about it, the sun's rays, you think about how you feel in the sun. So there's a whole world of conversation on this, and I'm not going to go too deeply, but there is a book which is by Demetrius Panagopoulos, really important, called Electromagnetic Fields of Wireless Communications, Biological and Health Effects, and I highly recommend it if you want to delve into the science and also a bit deeper into the technical aspects. What he talks about in his book, and as many other scientists talk about, is how artificial electromagnetic fields are very different than natural electromagnetic fields. One key difference is that they are polarized. And they're also complex waveforms, like wireless signals are not just the carrier frequency. You might have heard 900 megahertz or 5G operates off, this frequency or that frequency, but those are actually the carrier waves. Wireless signals are pulsed and modulated. They actually involve multiple frequencies to transmit the information, including lower frequency components, which are implicated in some of the biological effects in research. Electricity also can be complex. It can be pulsed. There's switching power supplies like phone chargers, LED lights, smart meters, solar inverters, variable speed motors, which have been reported to be impactful to health as well, to health. So what are we talking about with wireless? When I first began this issue, it was just the cell phone. But now we're surrounded by wireless devices. And of course, the cordless phone. I had a cordless phone at my home. And one of the ways that I got into this issue was I got myself a meter to measure the levels in my home. And I found that right at my desk, there was these high levels. I couldn't figure out what was doing this. I had my phone was turned off. I wasn't using a cell phone. My computer was wired because in those days, there wasn't necessarily Wi-Fi in every room. We only had Wi-Fi on the other side of the house, not at my desk. And it turned out it was the home cordless phone because the base station emanates radiation constantly. And it was just sitting there right at my face for hours a day. So there's also now earbuds, those putting them in your ears, wireless. There's Wi-Fi routers, smart speakers, video game consoles, smartwatches, fitness trackers that are wireless, your wireless keyboard, printer, anything Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, utility meters that are so-called smart, and of course cell towers or building mounted antennas, any kind of base station antennas. And then in terms of lower frequency electromagnetic field sources, and there's everything from power lines, electrical substations, electrical wiring in your home, electrical panels. You don't want to be sleeping with your back against the wall to the electrical panel in your home, charging cords, electrical blankets, appliances. I go into kids' dorms room and they have the microwave and the refrigerator right underneath their bed because they have the bed on these stilts and they're trying to fit everything in a tiny little room. And they're getting levels of very low frequency EMFs day and night, if they're sitting studying on that bed and at nighttime when they're sleeping. And then there's a lot of occupational sources as well, both to wireless as well as lower frequency electromagnetic fields, welding machines, induction furnaces, and that is a whole important issue that I wish I could talk to you today, but that is the issue of occupational exposure, which is growing, which is unaddressed in the United States. There are numerous thousands of scientific studies that have reported impacts from wireless and electromagnetic fields. I know you've heard already about cancer and tumors, glioblastoma or acoustic neuroma, thyroid cancer. There are case reports that document cancers that have developed right in a woman's breast underneath where she or many young women actually who reported this, had the cell phone that they carried in their bra. The reproductive impacts, such as decreased sperm, decreased testosterone, damage to the testes, impacts to the ovaries and the environment in the ovaries, to the follicles. There's synergistic effects that have been found when there are studies that have looked at combining wireless or low frequency electromagnetic fields with another known toxin, such as radiation, lead, black carbon, and they found enhanced toxicity, tumor promotion, impacts to the immune system, genotoxicity, and behavioral impacts from those combined exposures. There are also symptoms that have been reported and documented in case reports and in published studies on people that have acute impacts, headaches, brain fog, neurological symptoms, impacts to their sleep when they are heavily exposed to, oftentimes it's a cell tower, or sometimes it's a combination where there's been a mold exposure or cell tower antennas that have been placed right near their home, or could be in a school where teachers have been exposed to high levels of Wi-Fi from the industrial Wi-Fi systems. In the brain, studies that have looked at the brain, there have been impacts to brain cells, altered brain activity, damage to memory, impacts to the neurotransmitters. And I worked for many years directing an inpatient therapy program. It is this research that really brought me to working on this issue in an intense way, because when I learned about the impacts to the brain, having worked with kids who had prenatal exposure to drugs, that really got me on this issue and delving into the rabbit hole, which it really is. So impacts to the endocrine system, to thyroid, the adrenal gland, and you see higher cortisol as well in research. And at the cellular level, there's what's been documented as a cellular stress response, impacts to mitochondria. And very importantly is oxidative stress, because when prolonged, oxidative stress can lead to inflammation, and that can lead to a host of other health impacts. So the majority of research on wireless has found impacts when you look at some of the key endpoints. Dr. Henry Lai, who's a bioengineering professor at the University of Washington and editor-in-chief of electromagnetic biology and medicine, he found the majority of research over the last few decades has found effects. And every couple months, he updates this analysis. It's online at both the BioInitiative report as well as Dr. Joel Moskowitz's website at Safer EMR. The majority of oxidative studies that looked at oxidative endpoints, at genetic endpoints, at neurological endpoints, reproductive and development as well. I know I've been in many hearings, legislative hearings, where industry-funded scientists or those who are coming to testify paid by the industry will actually say that the majority of research shows no effect, and that's simply not true. Again, you can go to the website of Dr. Moskowitz at Safer EMR. I'm trying to, throughout this presentation, show you some resources, give you pieces of this issue, and places you can go for more. But we are all exposed. Both people and wildlife are exposed. I'm going to be talking about wildlife later on, but the way that our limits are, they are non-protective, not just to us, but to animals and to nature. So I want to start out with exposure. This is an image from the ITIS Foundation, and they actually do a lot of the technical machinery that helps engineers to look at exposure, to measure exposure. And the reason I'm bringing this forward, even though a lot of it is still looking at heat, which I'm going to talk about how heat is not the only harm, I think it's really important to first understand that we are being exposed. It might be invisible. You might not be able to smell it or taste it, but it's very much there. So these images are useful in sort of understanding what's going on because it is invisible. And what they do, there's a series of engineering studies that use this kind of technology. So I just wanted to introduce it to you, is they will simulate exposure to various parts of the body. and try to look anatomically at the different structures, the skin, the brain, the eyes, the blood vessels, and so forth. And they'll come up with these images, which really is like if you took a slice and here's a phone to the head, and you can see there are light colors to dark colors. So it goes from white to yellow to orange to red to purple to blue. And those colors represent the intensity, the rate of absorption. So here's just an example that they had on their website. And here is an image that I hope you have already seen. And if not, it's really important. That is how children, proportionate to adults, have higher RF radiation or microwave radiation, wireless radiation absorption into their heads and brains. It goes deeper into a child. What you're seeing is computer modeling of cell phone radiation that was by Claudio Fernandez and colleagues. It's published in Environmental Research, and they looked at a phone to the head of different child models as well as adult models. They looked at a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 11, 14, and they compared them to a head model of a 26 and 35-year-old. And they found tenfold greater absorption rates into the cerebellum and bone marrow of the skull, 30-fold into the hippocampus, which is a critically important area of the brain for memory, and 2 to almost 5-fold higher into the eyes. This is a very important paper. It's called The Absorption of Wireless Radiation into the Child versus Adult Brain and Eyes from Cell Phone Conversation or Virtual Reality, published in Environmental Research. Several of those engineers also looked at the Wi-Fi absorption from a tablet into the head of a 6-year-old. And here you can see, depending on, they were just showing the way the radiation comes out of the tablet, the levels into the head of a child. And this is a simulation looking at a child with a laptop at about 6 inches from their eye lens. Children are considered more vulnerable and uniquely vulnerable to wireless radiation, as with other environmental impacts, because they absorb proportionally more. They also have more sensitive brains. They're going to have a lifetime of exposure. And it starts before birth. So I did this. I would wear my first baby, or both babies, in a sling. And I used to have the phone right near my child's head. In fact, I would carry the phone in the pocket of the sling that I had, with the phone right against my daughter's body. I had no idea that cell phones emitted radiation. I literally thought it was like magic. I don't know. I didn't know anything about it at the time, which is now 23 years ago. And what I didn't know is that there was such a wealth of science indicating that safety was not just not assured, but that there were adverse effects. I did not know, and I'm glad that I found out. And when I learned about it and began working on this issue, I really have focused on impacts to children as well as wildlife, because a child's brain is still developing and we need to protect their brains. So I think where we are is where we were with cars before seatbelts and bikes when people don't wear helmets. There are safe ways to use this technology. There are safer ways too, but there's safety that we can have if we all work together, both on the personal level, raising awareness, but also at the policy level. Because right now we have a situation where, you see this all the time, right? Mother, child, phone in the hand, holding the baby, and parents are completely unaware about this issue. And that in many countries, they are actually informing people about this issue. Whereas in the United States, we only hear that if you are worried, here's 3 little tips you can do to reduce exposure. It's completely ridiculous. So young brains are rapidly developing, and we have critical windows of vulnerability. Early exposure can disrupt this growth at critical stages of brain development, and that can lead to potentially long-term cognitive or behavioral effects. There is a paper on wireless radiation and brain development. It's Kaplan et al., where they have looked at the several studies that have investigated actually in animals, because we can't cut open, kids. We can't be cutting open human heads, although we are certainly experimenting on them without them knowing, but we're not cutting them open and looking at what's going on after exposure. But they are doing that with animals. There are several studies where they have exposed animals to wireless radiation, to a cell phone that's near the cage, and they found impacts. This is a study by Odachi and colleagues where they looked at exposure before birth. It's prenatal exposure, and there was a significant loss of brain cells in a region involved in learning and memory, the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. And this study is called Effects of Prenatal Exposure at 900 megahertz electromagnetic field on the dentate gyrus of rats, a stereological and histopathological study. You can go online to PubMed, look at these studies, then look at what these researchers have published. There have been many publications by this group. Just recently, there was a publication in the International Journal of Developmental Neuroscience also looking at impacts to brain cells. This is rats exposed in utero, and they actually looked at different periods of the pregnancy. They exposed the rats at different times, and then they looked at the hippocampus, and they found the neurons of the exposed rats became darkly stained and shrunken. They would cut slices, look at them in a microscope, count, and also observe. They found cellular damage in their brains. They had a higher level of proteins associated with cell death in the regions of the hippocampus, and specifically that play an important role in memory formation. And importantly, they found effects that were heightened during later in pregnancy, exactly during a time period when there was this specific kind of brain development. And they conclude this could potentially lead to long-term deficits in cognitive abilities. You'll hear this over and over again. This could cause this could cause that. What isn't the complication with this issue, if you're hearing about this, I know this is how I felt. I was like, well, why isn't anyone doing anything? Well, science is ongoing. Scientists are just asking questions, researching, continuing to do their work. And it is the policymakers and the groups, the scientific experts that are looking at the whole picture that need to be fully looking at this and coming up with recommendations based on the science. However, in the United States, we don't have that right now. Even though the World Health Organization International Agency for Cancer classified wireless radiation as a possible carcinogen in 2011, over a decade ago, because of the studies that found associations between heavy cell phone use and glioma and glioblastoma, a malignant type of brain cancer. The US government has not looked at their limits, which are from 1996. We haven't had a full review of this issue. In fact, the US EPA, which was looking at this issue in the 70s and 80s, was fully defunded from looking at the science on this and coming up with federally developed safety limits. We don't even have those. So in 1996, the government established our so-called safety limits, or the really guidelines about what we're allowed to be exposed to for wireless and cell phone radiation. But at that time, they did not have studies. So they said they didn't have adequate studies to understand what the long-term effect might be. So the US FDA recommended that the National Toxicology Program study this issue using animals. And that research took $30 million and years and years and years. It was nominated in 1999. We didn't see the first report to 2016, and then the final report in 2018, when they concluded with all of they exposed rats and mice to cell phone radiation, and they found clear evidence of tumors in the hearts of the male rats. It's malignant schwannomas, some evidence of tumors in the adrenal glands, and some evidence of tumors in the brains of male rats, malignant gliomas. And these kinds of tumors are comparable to the kinds of tumors that studies on humans have found when they've looked at heavy cell phone use. They also found that radiofrequency radiation exposure, cell phone radiation, was associated with an increase in DNA damage in the specific areas, the frontal cortex of the brain in male mice, the blood cells of the female mice, and the hippocampus of male rats. Now, they just shouldn't have found anything. They shouldn't have found anything, but they did. And then the FDA came out, who nominated the National Toxicology Program to do the study, came out and said that, well, they're animals, not humans, and downplayed this study. However, there are many scientists who have published on this issue, who are experts in the field, and they have concluded that at this point, if the WHO, International Agency for Research on Cancer, were to look at all of the evidence, the human evidence, that done in petri dishes, as well as the animal evidence, which this study is relatively new, post-2011, that they would conclude that wireless radiation is a proven, and some are saying, if not probable, carcinogen. And then there would have to be policy changes, certainly in the European Union, where they follow the precautionary principle. There would be some major changes. And I should also mention that the Ramazzini Institute also did a large-scale study exposing rats to radiofrequency radiation, and they also found the same tumor types as the National Toxicology Program study did. And yet, we are not being informed about this issue, and women put cell phones in their bra. We don't just hold phones up to our head, but putting cell phones in our bra and the spandex pants in the tight pants pocket. People are hugging our phones all day, and they're on day and night. So there's research that has found breast cancer developing right underneath where women stored their phone in their bra. And this is a case report that was published on young women with no genetic history who developed unusual multifocal tumors. There's also a case control study that found excessive smartphone use significantly increased the risk of breast cancer, particularly for participants in the study who had a close distance between the breasts and the smartphone, and who use the smartphone before bedtime. And I see all the time people using phones with just literally pressed up to your chest, right? You're sort of like a little shelf. You can use your chest as a shelf. Pregnant women also use their abdomen as a shelf, really not knowing that there is radiation being emitted from these devices. So this is another case report called "Where is Your Smartphone?" It's entitled "Where is Your Smartphone? An Unusual Mass Within the Tensor Fascia Latae Muscle." Sorry if I said that wrong. And it's published in Radiology Case Reports in 2023. And they found a 40-year-old man with an intramuscular schwannoma in the area where he stored his smartphone for 8 hours a day in his front left trouser pocket. Excuse me. And I can say, having worked in this field for over a decade, we are contacted all the time by people who have these stories. Unfortunately, many of them have passed away, and before they died, they wanted their story to be told. They share their story online, and people who call up and say, I have a tumor on my leg right where I held that laptop for 8 hours a day while I was working. I knew, because this is the side where the way the desk was, I always had that laptop on my lap, or people who had the cell phone in their pocket and developed tumors. And yet, we have clothes where pockets are being made bigger and clothes are changing in order to accommodate that phone right in the pocket. The Girl Scout uniform was updated for Gen Z. They actually designed the vest so that it has pockets and that they're large enough to fit the largest model of the iPhone. Okay, so how is the government dealing with this issue at all? I want to share this with you and talk a little bit about wireless radiation limits, what they are, what other countries are doing, and then delve into some of the more rabbit hole issues on this. But just starting out, we in the United States have among the most lenient exposure limits when it comes to what can cell towers emit, what can be in the air wherever we are. So, for example, if you're at a school and you're concerned about this issue, maybe you work there, or you're concerned about your child, what the school will do is definitely have someone come out with a meter. They will take it and wave it around in the classroom, and they will say, we measured it. In fact, the levels in the school are so low compared to our federal limits. The US limits are among the highest of all the countries in the world. And there are many countries that have limits which are 10 to 100 times lower than US limits. And that's because they either follow the precautionary principle, such as in Europe, or some countries have their own research scientists who have investigated this issue, and they recognize non-thermal impacts, and they have dropped the limits lower because of that. Now, I will say that that doesn't ensure safety, that even these limits with more stringent thresholds, that does not necessarily ensure safety, but they certainly are much more, I'm not even going to say more protective, but I'm just going to say they recognize that there could be effects at much lower levels. And we are really behind the times on this issue. This is actually just for 1,500 megahertz, or 1,800 megahertz, I should say, for the limits that you see here. The US at 1,500 megahertz all the way to 100,000 megahertz has the same power density limits. And our limits are based on heat, that heating is the only harm. The safety limit was set back in 1996 under the assumption that wireless radiation cannot cause any other health effect other than tissue heating. And they were not designed to protect against biological impacts at all, such as cancer or all the other effects that I just repeated earlier in this talk, simply from heat. And I like to show the picture of the hamburger with the fire, because there are also so many other issues with our limits. They average the exposure over tissue, certain volumes of tissue. And you think about, if there's a piece of meat that's being grilled, you're going to have the inside might not be cooked, but the outside might be quite crispy. But if you average the level of heat, you might say that that hamburger is not even completely cooked. However, there are edges, as you can see, that are burnt. Now, I'm not talking about us getting burned by our phones, okay? That you have to have a lot of wireless radiation to see burns. And there are burns that have been reported in climbers that have been overexposed and so forth. However, there can be damage from this exposure. And heat is not the only harm. It's completely ridiculous. How did we get here? Is from outdated science about 50 years ago, and frankly earlier when these ideas were developed. There are animal studies from the 70s and early 80s that were done with just a I mean, the sample sizes were small, a few rats and small monkeys, and they were trained to press a lever for food. They took the animals, they exposed them to under an hour of high-intensity microwave radiation, and the level at which they stopped pressing the lever for food was the level at which the engineers and industry scientists who are doing this research said that's harmful. We have a behavioral disruption here. It's the behavioral studies, behavioral animal studies, and they then said this is the level at which there is harm. So heat is the problem. They set a level, and that level has been the level by which is considered harmful ever since then, even though we're now half a century later and the limits have not changed. Now, this study by the International Commission for the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields is very important. So when people tell you it's totally safe, FCC limits are totally safe, this is the study. You need to go, you can find it, you can download it. It's open access online, very important paper. They detail how the wireless exposure guidelines of the FCC and of ICNIRP, the International Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, which honestly protects radiation more than people. They have limits very similar to the FCC. They detail the false assumptions that US government wireless radiation limits are based on. And they go over the history. They document how these limits are non-protective and make recommendations to protect sensitive and vulnerable populations, children, pregnant people, and also those with electromagnetic hypersensitivity in the environment. You can also go to their website, icbeemf.org, and learn more. They have scientific publications which include publication on how software and hardware changes can reduce your exposure and what industry can do, what companies can do. And there have been many, over the years, dozens of appeals by expert scientists calling for reductions in public and environmental exposure. This is the International Scientist Appeal to the United Nations to protect humans and wildlife from electromagnetic fields and wireless technology. It was started in 2015. There are now over 250 scientists from 44 nations that have signed on to this appeal. It's emfscientists.org. They are calling for guidelines to be strengthened, that manufacturers develop safer technology, that utilities monitor the electricity and the power quality, and that the public be fully informed, that there be more transparency, that medical professionals be educated, and that governments fund training and research on electromagnetic fields and health. There's also the 5G appeal at 5gappeal.org, now signed by over 438 experts. And all of this information has been sent to the US federal government. So going back several years ago in 2012 and 2013, the US FCC asked, should we update our limits? They're from 1996. And, should we make any changes? Is there science that shows that we should tighten our limits, protect children? Should we make changes in the way we check phones for compliance? They asked all these questions. And thousands of submissions were sent with tens of thousands of pages of documentation by scientists, the EMF Scientist Appeal, publication after publication. I put in hundreds of publications myself, as did many others, about the biological effects and how the current limits based on heating are simply not protective. And the US FCC decided in 2019, even after having all of that research, that it would maintain its 1996 limits. These limits do not address, they were not even designed. And this is what blew my mind, that the limits we have, they weren't designed to address biological effects from non-heating exposures. They weren't designed to address long-term exposures or exposures from cumulative sources. Right now, right, you might have a phone, a laptop, a smart speaker, a printer. In fact, I heard Comcast boasting that there's 20 wireless devices average in every home. So we're surrounded by all these devices. And then you might have a cell tower outside or a 5G tower right outside your window. These limits were not designed to address children's vulnerability because they didn't even have research on impacts to children, actually, at that time. They weren't designed to address wildlife, birds, bees, and trees at all, period, full stop. So after the US FCC decided in 2019 that it would maintain its limits that were set in 1996, and really they go back further than that, which is quite another story, but at the time, I was executive director of Environmental Health Trust, and our organization, including myself, I'm actually a petitioner in this case, as well as Children's Health Defense, and many petitioners filed a lawsuit against the US FCC on this issue. And we had a ruling in 2021 by the US Court of Appeals, DC Circuit, that ruled that the decision not to update their 1996 limits of the FCC was arbitrary and capricious because the FCC had not shown that they had properly examined the issues related to non-cancer impacts, such as impacts to the brain or reproductive system, impacts to sperm, long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, and they had also completely failed to address environmental effects. And one other issue that was a really important part of this case that I'm going to talk about is that the US FCC is keeping this outdated test procedure by which cell phones are tested not in body contact. Phones are not tested touching the body, but they are tested in this completely antiquated, outmoded test system. And they were ordered to explain how their limits were protective for these issues that they had ignored, basically to show their work, which we were all interested in too, because we wanted to see, hey, if you think these limits are safe, why do you think that? And the FCC has not responded at all to the court order. They didn't go to the Supreme Court, so this decision stands. So here we are. Consumers are buying phones. They are not aware that one device, that even just this one cell phone has so many frequencies. I mean, what you need to know is that all of these devices, smartphones, tablets, laptops, they can have at least 5 different antennas. Actually, newer phones have many more than that, and they might be like all around the phone, at different parts of the phone, from LTE, Wi-Fi, 5G, Bluetooth, plus there's blue light. And then we're also exposed from the electrical components, including if you're charging the phone. You do not want to be using a phone if it's charging. We are not informed that when we use more than one device, you're getting higher exposure. And what you're seeing here is another simulation done where they looked at a cell phone, using a cell phone plus a Wi-Fi laptop. And what this study found is that they looked at the cell phone alone, then they looked at the laptop alone, then they looked at the phone and the laptop, and they found that if you're making a mobile call in the presence of a laptop, that actually there can be a 20% increase in the specific absorption rate into the head. That is a measure of the rate of absorption, which is a whole other story I'm not going to get into here, but it's generally used, although it's a completely inadequate metric, to talk about the level. So, yeah, we are not being informed about that. In fact, the whole way that we test phones is so egregious. I'm going to talk about how phones are tested versus how we use them. So phones are pre-market tested before they come on the market, not for safety. not for will you have a health effect, but rather for do the phone's emission meet the government limit? The government limit, which is outdated and non-protective, completely irrelevant, but nonetheless, we have a limit. Even that limit is being exceeded in certain positions of use. Test the phones are just, I'm going to explain. They are not tested in body contact. So we might use the phone touching our body, okay, pressed up against our chest or up against your abdomen, but phones are not tested that way. This is on this side of the screen, an example of how we test phones for the body contact limit. There's this big tub filled with a thick liquid, which supposedly replicates our brain and body tissue, which it does not. And then the phone is put up to it, and there's a thermometer that goes up and down in the liquid, taking temperature, okay, in a grid pattern. And it's probably a very good grid pattern. Probably, machines can do that. However, it's using a metric that only measures heat. And the limit that it's set to is, of course, irrelevant to health, the SAR limit. It also averages the level. So when it takes the temperature, there's averaging that's going on, both in terms of time and also tissue. And that masks peak exposures, as I was talking about with the hamburger image. It's also based on a large adult male, 6'2" and 220 pounds, yet 97% of the population is smaller. And that uniform liquid is not reflective of a real human tissue. I mean, obviously. And the test positions with the distance between the phone and the body is not reflective of real world use. And over here, I have, just to show you, an image of the cell phone being held up to the phantom. And you can see there's a space there because there's a spacer that's used between the phone and the phantom. And that's why if you look in the fine print of your devices, which used to be in the little brochures you used to get with your devices, now it's in the setting of the phone, or you have to go online to find it. But they'll actually say body-worn SAR testing, this is the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 3 5G, has been carried out at a separation distance of 1.5 centimeters. To meet RF exposure guidelines during body-worn operation, the device should be positioned at least this distance away from the body. I certainly didn't know that when I got my cell phone. The Apple iPhone 16 has a 5 millimeter separation, which they state, although rather obscurely, in their legal and regulatory settings, as does the SE. And back in 2016, unlike the United States, the French government decided to test cell phones. They tested over 400 cell phones, some of those at 0 millimeter from the body phantom in these SAR tests. And they found that the majority of them violated the EU limits for what a cell phone is allowed to emit. Now, Professor Om Gandhi published an analysis looking at the French government tests and found that if you did the equations to bring that information to the way the US government has their limits and the way that they measure and test phones, that actually those phones would exceed limits up to 11 times FCC limits. So phones exceed government safety limits already outdated when they are in full body contact and operating at highest power. Now, what ended up happening is that the French National Agency for Food, Environment, and Occupational Health, ANSES, basically like the FDA of France, issued a report, and they recommended that the cell phone measurements, the pre-market safety test measurements, be done at 0 millimeters from the body, a distance that better reflects the actual use of mobile phones, because we use them. I mean, children, babies in grocery carts, right? They'll have the phone, it'll be like pressed up to their chest, or it'll be right up to their eyes, right? Phones should be tested the way we use them, which is basically hugging the phone. So The French ministers, they issued a press release. They called for updates in government consumer information, that it be put out, that when you bought a phone, you would be informed to limit children's use and to keep it away from the belly of pregnant women and the lower abdomen of adolescents. Because of course, there it's, exposing your, all your intestine and everything, but also your reproductive organs as well. And what happened? Well, the European Union strengthened its regulations. And now, because it used to be that the manufacturer could choose how much of a separation distance, it normally was up to 25 millimeters. And now it got tightened to 5 millimeters. Now, I need to clarify, 5 millimeters may seem like just a little bit, but it actually is a lot. When it comes to wireless radiation, electromagnetic fields, every millimeter makes a difference in terms of your exposure. So the EU strengthened regulations for pre-market safety tests. And in 2020, France filed an objection, and they said, no, these need to be tested. Phones and devices need to be tested at 0 millimeters from the body, not just 5 millimeters. Now, I should tell you that in the United States, we still allow manufacturers to choose how they want to test phones, be it 5 millimeters, 10, up to 25 millimeters. They have stated that they have interim guidance, and now they've actually said that they would be changing it, but it's been years, and so far they haven't changed it. So companies can still decide how they want to test their phones. And if they test the phone at a distance, then the phone becomes compliant. But when you test the phone the way we actually use phones today, in body contact positions, there are many models which could exceed limits. So PhoneGate is a really important website to be aware of. It was coined by a French doctor, Marc Arazi, who compared this issue to Dieselgate, where that's the Volkswagen emission saga, where cars passed the diesel emission tests when they tested in laboratory conditions, but when they were driven on real roads, the way people drive cars, the emissions exceeded limits. And in the same way, cell phones can legally pass SAR tests in certified cell phone compliance engineering laboratories, but not the way we actually use devices. So you can go to PhoneGate for more on that. And what they have been tracking is that 58 cell phone models have been found to exceed government radiation limits in France. And I'm talking about not at body contact, but with the manufacturer's separation distance, because the French ANFR is actually testing phones with that manufacturer's distance, but it's independent testing. And they're finding that while the phones came on the market and the companies said that they were compliant, that actually, even with that test distance, some phones were exceeding limits. And 58 have been software updated or just pulled off the market due to this oversight, this enforcement program. Now you might ask, well, in the United States, do we test phones? I mean, does the government take phones off the shelf and test them to make sure that they comply with the government's outdated limits? Well, I thought the answer was no, because there certainly is nothing online, and we don't really have a surveillance program. We operate with the honor system. Okay, so there's no checking, is both for phones and towers. The companies have laboratories where they get their phones tested. They send in the test, and there is no checking to make sure, well, let's take the phone and test it to make sure that this test that we have is actually adequate. So I have investigated the federal government and various agencies. I've done over 300 Freedom of Information requests. Those are where you write to different agencies and you ask for records related to something very specific. And what I found is that the US FCC actually had tested some phones, very few, by the way, I'm going to tell you the story about this. But they then suppressed the findings. And they actually found that phones exceeded the FCC SAR limit when the phone was tested at 2 millimeters from the body, like in a pocket. I'll call it the pocket test. I found that out years later from one of my my FOIA investigations. And I'm going to tell you this story about starting at the beginning. Well, it's not the beginning of the whole story, but it's the beginning of how the FCC decided to do such tests. So back several years ago, the Chicago Tribune decided to take phones, get them tested in an FCC accredited laboratory and see the radiation. And they also tested the phones at 2 millimeters from the body. They called it the pocket test. They came out with a report saying that the phones that they had tested showed exceedances, violations of the FCC limit, especially when it came to the pocket test. Now, right after that, the FCC, let me go back to this. The FCC said they're going to investigate this. Then a few months later, there's a report that comes out from the FCC saying that they tested the phones and that they found that there were no violations of any FCC rules. That was in 2019. And by the way, that was right around the time when the FCC decided to maintain its 1996 limits in 2019, and also to maintain the way they test phones without a separation distance. So then the Chicago Tribune did a follow-up article that said the FCC says the tests find cell phones comply with federal limits on radio frequency radiation. The FCC's recent study, and in this long report that the Chicago follow-up article they did, they kind of ended it right at the end. They said, the FCC's recent study did not test phones at 2 millimeters distance. Only what I found from my Freedom of Information request was that the FCC had tested phones at 2 millimeters and they had found exceedances. This is a screen save right here from the spreadsheet that was sent to me when I asked, send every cell phone radiation SAR test that the FCC has done at any level of separation distance. And at first, actually, they didn't want to give me any records. They told me to go to the FCC website. And I said, no, I want to know. And I had to follow up with them on it. And this says confidential. This spreadsheet says confidential, and it shows that the phones they tested when it was at 2 millimeters, several of the models exceeded differences. And they even sent me a letter which said, we observed that at 2 millimeter separation distance, the FCC radio frequency exposure limits were exceeded. And here's the letter. You can go online to the Environmental Health Trust, to their FOIA documents where you can find all of these. And what's really important, I mean, there's so many accountability issues here. But not only was this withheld from the public and from the Chicago Tribune that was doing the report, because when the Chicago Tribune came out saying, look, the FCC tested, the phones passed the test, you know, it makes it seem like that the whole issue was null and void, when actually they had this information that they hadn't shared. But there were also some really important lawsuits that were happening at the same time. And the FCC omitted this information from these two court cases. One was Apple versus Cohen, where consumers who'd bought phones alleged that the phones emitted excessive radiation and that the manufacturers had engaged in deceptive marketing by showing the phone near the body and not informing them about this. The other was Berkeley versus CTIA, where the wireless industry was suing the city of Berkeley for its cell phone right to know ordinance, which directed consumers to the fine print warnings in the manuals to keep the distance. And the wireless industry had said that that violates the free speech rights of the companies, and the Berkeley shouldn't be allowed to do that, to make retailers do that. So these two cases were happening, and the FCC filed a statement in both of these cases about the issue, and they didn't include this information that says that they had found that when the phone was closer, that it could actually exceed limits in the pocket test. They also omitted this information, as I talked about, from the major FCC proceeding that was going on, the rulemaking. They had asked in 2013 specifically if it was appropriate to consider zero spacing or actual contact with the body when testing for the cell phone. They asked, should we change the way we test phones? And they never shared that with the people or put it in the docket or in their decision to not have any change. In fact, they say that it's unnecessary. They specifically said it's unnecessary to test phones at 0 millimeters. And I'll note that many organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, had submitted to the FCC calling on cell phone test systems to be updated to reflect real-world current use patterns. Oh yeah, I was talking about this, but I'll just quote the FCC back in 2019. They knew that phones exceeded limits, but yet they said, even though some parties claim that the RF exposure evaluation procedures for phones should require testing with zero spacing against the body, this is unnecessary. So the Court of Appeals decision in 2021, after we sued the FCC, I should note, included the issue of cell phone testing. This has not been addressed yet by the FCC. They haven't responded to the court, but they specifically said that the FCC needed to provide a reasoned explanation for its decision to retain its test procedures. So let me share some more things, even going back in time, because one question I have is, well, do the companies know? I mean, I have a cell phone. I don't use it that much. I use it very differently than other people. Some people may say that we shouldn't have cell phones at all, and I understand that argument, because really we need to have wired technology everywhere. But nonetheless, did companies know about this? So with Apple iPhone 3, if you go back in time and you look at what they said in the manuals, and you also can go online to find these manuals, you'll find that they used to be very clear about how a consumer should use the phone. Here's the Apple iPhone 3. Apple iPhone SAR measurement may exceed FCC exposure guidelines for body-worn operation if positioned less than 15 millimeters, that's 5/8 of an inch, from the body, e.g., when carrying the iPhone in your pocket. They are telling you right there that it could exceed limits. And when using your iPhone near your body for voice calls or wireless data transmission over a cellular network, keep the iPhone at least 15 millimeters, that's 5/8 of an inch, away from your body. That is what the manual said. The iPhone 6 also said carry iPhone at least 5 millimeters away from your body to ensure exposure levels remain at or below the as tested levels. But that disappeared. So the phone came out, the manual said to carry the phone at least 5 millimeters away, and then that was removed. There was an online website where you can go, and it's the Wayback Machine. If you don't know about the Wayback Machine, go to the Wayback Machine. You can get all the information about everything that you ever want to know. Also, what there used to be on the website, they will show the changes. You can go to every year, months in the year, and find out what a website looks like at a certain time and date. So what I found is that this statement disappeared from the information for the iPhone 6 by November 17th. I'm sorry, November 2017. Same with the iPhone 7. It had come out saying, carry iPhone at least 5 millimeters away from your body to ensure exposure limits remain at or below the as tested levels. And that was also removed by November 2017. And here, just as a clip from the Wayback Machine, where you can see it clearly says that, and then it's gone. Now, other devices have this fine print warning. I don't know for how long. So the Xbox, wireline video gaming console actually has a 20 centimeter distance. Now, I'll never forget when, gosh, this was a long time ago when I was coming onto this issue. I wanted to share it with the world. I was meeting with everyone in my community, talking to moms. I was invited to all of these tea parties at people's homes. I go to a home of this wonderful woman. She has me there with all these other mothers. We're talking about the issue. Then she has me go around the house to measure the levels in the various rooms and figure out what is emitting radiation. I go to her son's bedroom and I have the meter in my hand, and the meter is going crazy outside of the room. I was like, well, I don't know what's going on in that room. So we open the door, and there is the bed with about at least three video game consoles right up against the bed. Somehow he just had them all up against the bed. And the TV was, on the back wall where you could video game from. But those consoles were emitting wireless radiation constantly, so high, right by his bed. I mean, it was like bed, video game consoles. And, even when you're not using them, they're on emitting radiation. Same with the Amazon Echo, all of these smart speakers. Even when they're not in use, they are always radiating. The Amazon Echo says this device should be installed and operated with a minimum distance of 20 centimeters between the radiator and your body. And yet kids are hugging these, sleeping next to them, having them tell them bedtime stories at night, with parents and families unaware that they're creating these exposures for their children. And, I wish the speaker could just inform whoever's using it that, look, why don't you contact the companies and have them make a wired one, wired to Ethernet to the internet, because it does not have to be wireless. I mean, that's the thing, is we're talking about all of these devices that people love and we become dependent on, but there are a lot of simple solutions. This can be solved by industry making changes to bring safer technology to market. It is not actually rocket science to fix this situation. It just requires people telling companies and policymakers, putting pressure on governments so that we have the political will to hold these companies accountable, and they will start competing for safety. Of course, the Amazon Echo Dot, uh, 20 centimeters different, 20 centimeters, I'm sorry, 20 centimeters between the radiator and your body in rainbow colors reminds me of cigarettes when they're marketed to kids. And here is the speaker. They collaborated with Lucky Charms. Did you catch Lucky? Just ask Alexa. Open the story of Lucky Charms and see what happens. And there was this whole campaign where Lucky Charms and Alexa worked together to have this wonderful story about Lucky Charms for the children. So companies are marketing this fairy tale of wireless safety by addressing four key areas. They have a multimedia public relations campaign. They're controlling the science. They've captured the government, and they have aggressive legal action against any moves by government towards transparency and accountability. So when it comes to the multimedia public relations campaign, the campaign is not just about selling products, it's about selling a narrative. The narrative asserts that wireless technology is safe, clean, and essential. But what the campaigns obscure is that there's a growing body of science, a substantial body of science by credible experts, linking wireless exposure to adverse biological effects. And this is a carefully crafted fairy tale, a house of cards, and the public remains largely unaware of the risks of this technology. Now, the fact that wireless radiation could be harmful has been known for decades. DNA damage was found in animal research performed decades ago in the mid-90s by Dr. Henry Lai and Singh and they found DNA damage from their research. They revealed the findings and they were attacked. What you're seeing is a microwave news article. It's a leaked memo between the wireless company Motorola and its PR firm. And the memory revealed a strategy still in use today, which is to war game the science. Dr. Lai's findings were attacked, discredited, and downplayed. They lined up scientists to publicly dispute the findings and attacked his credibility and tried to get his funding taken away. And what this Motorola memo states is, I think we have sufficiently wargamed the Lai-Sing issue. Now, it is notable that the PR firm, Burstyn Marsteller, was also one of the PR firms consulting to the tobacco industry. And at the time, they were also organizing a response to the EPA report, which had found that secondhand smoke was a human carcinogen. They actually they did a whole astroturfing campaign. They created a smokers' rights group, the National Smokers Alliance, to oppose the anti-smoking legislation that was being formulated. And there are many, many stories like this in the history of cell phone radiation and non-ionizing electromagnetic field research, where the science has been wargamed. There are also published papers on this because the industry controls the science and has undue influence into the science by funding studies where they're more likely, the results are more likely to produce industry-friendly results. And there's study by Huss et al. With a follow-up as well that found industry-funded studies are significantly less likely to report adverse effects. Higher quality independent studies tend to show stronger link between long-term mobile phone use and brain tumors, while studies with industry funding reported no significant association, Prasad 2017. Study by Dr. David Carpenter, who's done incredible work on this issue for years at the University of Albany, found that government independent studies consistently found links between power line electromagnetic field exposure and childhood leukemia, while industry-funded studies largely do not. And the group from Australia, ORSA, has done incredible work. Please go to their website as well. They did a paper looking at millimeter waves and found industry-funded studies investigating millimeter waves report lower effect outcomes, 58%, compared to government-funded studies, 83%, and institution-based studies, 93%, which did show an effect. So the government is where the industry's influence runs deep. Wireless companies heavily lobby policymakers. They shape laws and government regulations that serve the interests of industry that fast-track 5G and cell towers. And they're able, so they can get their products to market and their networks built as fast as possible. And this is a classic case of regulatory capture. So cell phone and wireless radiation, EMF radiation, just exemplifies the issue of regulatory capture in the United States. That's where the agencies that are meant to protect public health instead protect industry profits. This image you see is from a Harvard report, Captured Agency, how the FCC is dominated by the industry it presumably regulates. And it compares the tactics of the wireless industry to big tobacco. They use the same playbook to create doubt. And this report, which by the way is from 2015, also documents the heavy industry lobbying and money that has gone to Congress and decision makers over the years. And they highlight how the FCC exemplifies the revolving door between industry and government. Now, this revolving door has only become more, we have more examples. So we're now 10 years later, and I have a few slides showing the regulatory capture that have been updated to today, because the story just goes on. So as the Harvard report lays out with the FCC as exemplifying regulatory capture, the former FCC chair, Tom Wheeler, actually came from industry, where he was the head of the Wireless Association, the wireless industry lobby group in the United States. He became the FCC chair. During his tenure, he set the stage for the 5G rollout and for the deregulation that we have right now. And now he is a CEO of a telecommunications company's investment firm. You still see him featured as an expert speaking about this issue, even more recently in a GAO report that came out on 5G recently. I was shocked to see that. This is Brendan Carr. While he was a lawyer for Wiley Ryan, which was a law firm for the wireless industry, he was involved in the wireless industry's lawsuit against the city of San Francisco for its cell phone right to know lawsuit. And now he is the FCC chair. He was appointed to the FCC in 2017. Now he is the chair. And just as a brief overview of what San Francisco did or tried to do, because the wireless industry stopped it, they had adopted in 2010, 15 years ago, they adopted a point of sale cell phone radiation labeling legislation initiative, which included these posters and fact sheets that would be posted at point of sale when you went to buy your phone on why and how to minimize exposure from RF radiation from your cell phone. And as soon as it passed, the wireless industry, the CTIA, Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, immediately sued the city. They claimed, like they did with Berkeley, that the ordinance violated the free speech rights of the companies as guaranteed by the US Constitution. And ultimately, Berkeley had to abandon the effort in exchange for a waiver of industry's legal fees. Then you have Meredith Atwell Baker. She worked for the CTIA. She became the FCC commissioner. She went on then to lead the CTIA wireless industry. And guess what? She is retiring this year. Before I talk about who's taking her place, I'd like to show her exemplifying greenwashing. This was a conference that the CTIA held where she's got her butterfly dress on and she is sharing how 5G is saving the climate. And I kid you not, there is actually behind her is this image of the Earth, and it has cell towers coming off of it. And it's all about, the whole conference was about how 5G is fighting climate change, even though the reports are showing that 5G, the Internet of Things, and the way we are using this technology is increasing energy consumption because of the increased power needs of these networks, which are more powerful, and also because of the sheer amount of devices, all of these devices that we're using. Okay, so Meredith is retiring as the head of the CTIA, and who will take her place? Well, former FCC chair Ajit Pai will. He started out working both in industry and government. He was an in-house counsel for Verizon. Then he went on to be at the FCC for many years. He was FCC chair. And now he is taking the place of Meredith Atwell Baker as the new CEO and president of the CTIA wireless industry. So I've been talking about the different ways that industry is maintaining this fairy tale. Heavy and aggressive lawsuits is another tactic. And I talked about San Francisco. I mentioned Berkeley. I just want to tell you a little bit more about Berkeley because this was similar to San Francisco, but a little bit different because they passed a cell phone right to know ordinance, which was designed to withstand the court challenges because they knew the CTIA would sue them. So all it did was have this statement when it was first passed. This was the statement that you would get at point of sale if you carry or use your phone in a pants or shirt pocket or tucked into a bra when the phone is on and connected to a wireless network. You may exceed the federal guidelines for exposure to RF radiation. This potential risk is greater for children. Refer to the instructions in your phone or user manual for information about how to use your phone safely. This is factual, and it actually, the wireless industry tried to get it to the Supreme Court to knock it down. They did not win that. However, when the FCC submitted a filing on this issue, again, without the 2 millimeter test results, then the Berkeley was forced not to implement the law that it had passed unanimously. And also in relation to industry, the heavy industry aggressive tactics, if you just type in cell tower lawsuit, you will see all of these lawsuits where the wireless companies are suing localities over cell towers, not being allowed to put cell towers where they want to put them. Just tons, lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And you'll hear it in city council meetings, right? You'll be in a city council meeting, you're trying to have more responsible cell tower placement, so it's not right in front of your home or right in front of your kid's school. And the wireless industry will say, well, that, legally, we are, no, you can't do that. And they will threaten, they will actually talk about how that this is a legal issue and that they can sue. And the members, the decision makers, the council members will actually talk about, well, what if we get sued? And some have been quite afraid of that. Some are saying, we're going to stand up to this issue. This is not right. We should have some authority as to where this infrastructure is placed in our communities. And in all of these areas, the media, science, government, and the law, the wireless industry is manufacturing doubt. It's not just about defending products. It's about protecting the multi-billion-dollar business model at the expense of public health, transparency, scientific integrity, and the environment. So it's 4:27, and I know I can do a little bit longer, I was told, so I'm going to go ahead and do that because I want to address a couple issues. One is wireless in schools. Wireless was just being dumped into schools, sold to schools, I should say, because taxpayers were paying for this all across the country when I came into this issue back in 2012. And what we were not told is that there is exposure from the laptop antennas into the body as you are using a device. The closer it is, the more intense exposure you can have, especially relative to where the antenna is on the device. And yet what we're told is, things are going to be merry and bright and there's more enjoyment. We are not being informed about this issue. Schools, administrators are not told, teachers, families, kids. And this is a study by Soares et al., published in IEEE, that found that when you look at multiple devices in a classroom, there is increased exposure from all the devices. Because remember that FCC limits and the way our limits are for devices that are handheld devices or laptops and so forth, they really only look at one device at a time. And when you look at many devices all in use in a room, so in a classroom, you might have 30 kids, each who has a cell phone, right? They all have a transmitting cell phone somewhere, and this study didn't look at that. Then they all are looking at a laptop. They might all be watching a video streaming on the laptop. Plus there's a Wi-Fi router, might even be a cell tower outside. What this study did is look at all of the devices in the room, and they found increases in places that we haven't even thought about or properly researched, such as the spinal cord, the back. They found that when comparing one student alone to a full classroom and looking at a child, an exposure to a child, that you will start to get these exposures to the back, increases in exposure, at least twice in the hands, up to 40-fold in the back from all of the devices in the room. And you can get this paper online as well. Now, there are many ways that radiofrequency radiation exposure can be decreased in the classroom in schools, and many publications that have been done on this issue. There's the Collaborative for High Performance Schools Low EMF Wiring and Best Practice document. There are two publications which I was co-author on, Clegg et al., published in Building Science, What Makes a Smart and Healthy Building, and it was published in Building and Environment, and it details really the how and the why to reduce radio frequency wireless in buildings. Davis et al. On wireless technologies and children, published in Current Problems in Pediatric and Adolescent Healthcare. And that details the science looking at impacts to the endocrine system, to the brain, cancer, and then also has details on how medical institutions can reduce exposure, how schools can reduce exposure, how you can reduce exposure, what doctors can do. The New Jersey Education Association has an article on minimizing health risks from electronic devices, tech-safe schools. There's the Santa Clara Medical Association best practices in schools, which I'm going to talk about, and also the Maryland State Advisory Council guidelines on EMF, really important document that you can use as a resource on this issue. So let's talk about the Santa Clara Medical Association recommendations for best practices for technology in schools. They have details on the science, the why, and then they have some recommendations. Create a Safe Tech in Schools program to educate students and staff on how to reduce wireless exposures, keeping the devices on desks, not laps, using a speakerphone, keep the phones away from the body, put devices on airplane mode when not in use, and so forth. And don't use virtual reality headsets because those will get the phone right in front of your face. Have a cell phone free policy. All across the country, right? And gosh, across the world, phones are being prohibited in classrooms. They need to be bell to bell, so the whole school day, and they need to be fully powered off. That actually not only addresses the social media, the addiction, the impacts to school culture, but also reduces the levels of wireless radiation in the classroom. So it's really an important, perhaps side effect, because a lot of these groups who are doing the cell phone bans, for all the right reasons, by the way, don't know about this issue. It's a really important issue to bring into the conversation. Then there are recommendations regarding technology and infrastructure. So use hardwired Ethernet devices instead of Wi-Fi. I right now have my laptop plugged in with Ethernet, not Wi-Fi. Works fast, safe, secure, fantabulous. I love it. And I have the Wi-Fi off on my device as well. Get professional measurements, but independent professional measurements, not from the industry or company. Oh my gosh, how many schools do I know about where parents got concerned? They brought in the company measurer and found that levels are so low. And they took measurements that just would never hold up in court. And, you need to have professional measurements done. You also can really see if when you make changes to the way the network is, you'll be able to see decreases. You have to verify if you make a change, if it's really working, both for your home or for school. Avoid the installation of smart meters and enact a policy to restrict cell towers on or near school property. And of course, with curriculum that can be used, the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition has a series of curriculum that your school can download, that you can download. It's called Let's Talk Prevention, Actions You Can Take. And they don't just have it on cell phones, they also have it on water and plastics. Really just awesome resource. So they have a whole curriculum on cell phones and wireless. And I was honored and thrilled to have led that effort at the Environmental Health Trust alongside Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, who invited us to do that work. And it has sort of a summary of the science and what kids can do, and also some really interesting ways you can integrate it into the classroom, like in debate class. You could talk about, look, if you have, some studies showing effects and some not showing effects, what do you do? What do governments do? And there can be a debate. There are a lot of ways to get young people and our youth interested in this issue. They need to know about cell phones and wireless. They have a right to know about it. Right now, they're completely in the dark. In fact, they're completely saturated, right, by cell towers everywhere. This is the local high school near me. And this is a cell tower that went up, and then the school redesigned itself, but the tower stayed right where it was. And what do you know? It was just remodeled right up against that tower. In fact, if you see here, you can't see it too well, but here's a tree. There were a couple of trees that were here that had to be felled. They did not survive. Was it from the radiation from the tower? Well, that's a really good question. And there is research that indicates that towers with beams that are going right to trees in close proximity, that there's an effect on the trees. And some trees have had to be felled. They get damage to the crown and so forth. This was not research, so I can't say, but it certainly is interesting that the trees that were here have died. As on this side, there were actually more trees down a little bit. Can't see in the picture, that also had to be felled. So if you want a good review study on cell tower radiation, I recommend this publication in Environmental Research by Alfonso Balmori. It was published in 2022 entitled Evidence for a Health Risk by RF on Humans Living Around Mobile Phone Base Stations from Radiofrequency Sickness to Cancer. Reviewed the existing scientific research on people living near cell towers and found radiofrequency sickness, that's that constellation of microwave illness, electromagnetic sensitivity. There have been a lot of names, electromagnetic radiation syndrome, where there's headaches, dizziness, sleep problems, as well as increased cancer and also changes in biochemical parameters. Now, you might think that the US government is onto this issue and ensuring protection for people. But in fact, there is no agency of the US government that is currently looking at the issue of the environmental levels from radiofrequency radiation from cell towers and ensuring safety. Often the FDA will be pointed to if you ask about this. And one mother determined kept writing and got a letter from the FDA when she asked, look, I was told that when I asked about the cell tower near my home, that the FDA ensured safety, that because the FDA had found it to be safe, it was safe. So can you show me the studies on that? The FDA responded that the FDA does not regulate cell towers or cell tower radiation. Therefore, the FDA has no studies or information on cell towers to provide in response to your questions. So, you know, it's outrageous that there is no entity, no expert agency of the US government looking at this research and informing the public about it. Now, in other countries, cell towers are prohibited on school property. Russia, Israel, New Zealand, Chile, Greece, Bangladesh, Lithuania, for kindergarten specifically. And some countries actually have special regulations, like in France, levels must be minimized for base station antenna sites within 100 meters of a school. In some countries, you couldn't put a cell tower on a school because they have such stringent recommendations that they wouldn't be allowed to, because the emissions would violate those more stringent recommendations they have near homes and schools. Now, there are some US school boards that restrict cell towers on school property. Los Angeles, Palo Alto, Westland, Wilsonville, Temecula Valley Unified in California, Loudoun County near me. It is right down the Beltway here in Washington, D.C., the wealthiest county in the world. They now say no more cell tower leases on schools. They're prohibited. Any new leases. Several school districts have reversed course. Montgomery County no longer allows cell towers or new cell tower leases on elementary schools, so they say. Portland, Oregon ended consideration of new leases. Prince George's County decided not to renew the master cell tower leasing agreement that it had done, allowing all the schools, all the high schools, middle schools, to be cell tower sites, marketed as cell tower sites by a company. That's a story for another time. I lived through it. That was my county. So In LA, the Los Angeles, California Public School District, they say, now we don't know that they completely follow this, but nonetheless, they have utilized a precautionary threshold level that addresses the non-thermal exposures, and they have a limit set at 1,000 times lower than the FCC standard. So they say to protect children who they say are a potentially vulnerable and sensitive population. There are actually 3 Board of Education resolutions where they prohibit cell towers on or near the schools. And there are actually many communities that have large setbacks for wireless antennas so that they are distanced, set at a distance from homes and schools. I have a list right here. Now, when a new tower is proposed, the first question you might ask is, well, do you have insurance for damages if, from the long-term exposure, if there are health effects from exposure? And the answer is no, because insurance companies rank the risk as high. When it comes to cell towers, the issue is considered comparable to asbestos by insurance experts. And the standard is to now exclude coverage for RF damages. And that goes back many years ago because of reports showing that there are these non-thermal impacts that have been documented in studies. And of course, insurance companies don't want to risk it. So they have excluded damage from electromagnetic fields as industry standard in general policies for years. And there's been no coverage for electromagnetic field damages since 1997. And what you're seeing here was a cover of a report from Business Insurance, the next asbestos. And you see here, there's a cell tower image. They talk about it. And of course, the companies themselves, they actually define non-ionizing radiation, including electromagnetic fields, microwaves, as pollution, and they don't even cover it. So when you buy a phone, you can actually get protection package. So if it drops or falls or whatever, Verizon has it, several of the companies have these packages, but if you read the fine print, they will not cover for pollution impacts, and that includes wireless radiation. So it's considered a type of pollution by the wireless companies themselves. This paper is very important. It is a review paper looking at the issue of liability. It is for companies. It's called Limiting Liability with Positioning to Minimize the Negative Health Effects of Cellular Phone Towers. They reviewed the, quote, large and growing body of evidence that human exposure to radio frequency from cellular phone base stations causes negative effects, health effects, end quote. And they recommend restricting antennas near homes and within 500 meters of schools and hospitals to protect companies from future liability. And companies have known for a long time about this issue. In fact, the Ecolog Institute report from 2000, commissioned by T-Mobile, recommended an exposure limit 1,000 times lower than FCC's current power density limit. And in their recommendations, they say that that limit should be rigorously adhered to, especially in sensitive areas such as residential areas, schools, nurses, playgrounds, and hospitals, and all other places at which humans are present for longer than 4 hours. Companies warn shareholders, but not the people living near their infrastructure or the people who buy their products. They actually say in their 10K reports that there could be changes in the laws, that they might incur significant expenses in defending themselves against lawsuits, and that they don't have insurance in regards to this matter. And here I have the Verizon Wireless, Crown Castle, AT&T, and T-Mobile, their statements in their 10K reports to shareholders about this issue. And yet what we hear is this is 5G built right. It's really 5G built right in front of our homes. I was shocked when I just took a trip to Boston, and these are all over the place. There are towers, and they are just, they're on one end of the sidewalk, so they're just a few feet, can't be any more than 10 feet away from these windows, all across the entire city. There's another report I want to make sure you're aware of for your toolbox when you're addressing this issue in your community. And that's the European Parliament Study Research Report, Health Impact of 5G, that concluded for the commonly used frequencies that have long been used in wireless communications, as well as 5G, which uses all kinds of bands, ones we've used for forever, and then newer frequencies, that these fields are probably carcinogenic for humans, and in particular related to gliomas and acoustic neuromas, and clearly affect male fertility and possibly female fertility too. So take a look at that. My time is winding down. I'm going to take the whole time up because I want to get so much in, but I am not able to share some of the things I wanted to share with you. This is an image from Dr. Leonard Hardell and Tarmo Kopel looking at measuring levels, and these are important studies that you can share in your community that show that when you're closer to the antennas, like on the street or in their beams, when they're closer to the ground, that you can get higher intensities. There's also 7 case reports which were summarized by Leonard Hardell and Mona Nielsen that looked at health effects in 16 individuals after 5G base stations were installed near their homes. There are 7 case reports that look at them. And they found within hours of the 5G activation, participants experienced symptoms, sleep disturbances, fatigue, headaches, irritability, difficulty concentrating, memory issues, and that when the people left the situation, moved out of their homes or their apartment, left those workplaces, that then those symptoms decreased. And if you don't know about what's happening in New York and the 5G, please take some time to search 5G cell towers in New York City. The city government calls them kiosks because some of them have this little kiosk thing at the bottom, but they're gigantic. 2,000 of these jumbo 5G poles are planned. They're 32 feet high, many 10 feet from bedrooms and living spaces. And New Yorkers were furious. There are a total of 16, maybe more, community boards that have issued disapprovals or moratoriums or we don't want them about these poles because they are ugly, big, they emit radiation, and it's been outrageous that the government has been allowing these to go up across the city. There was just a rally against a tower from one that's being proposed in Forest Hills, right near a historic elementary school and a playground. And if you're interested in this, please go to the National Call for Safe Technology or Wired Broadband or New Yorkers for Wired Tech to learn more about that. This is just an image from their recent protest. Oh, I've got 11 minutes. So birds, I'm going to talk about wildlife so briefly, so important. Birds nest and perch on transmitting cell antennas, and they are so highly exposed. Please take the time to read this 3-part landmark research study by US experts. It's over 1,200 studies that have been looked at about the effects of non-ionizing radiation to animals. Blake Levitt, Henry Lai, and Albert Manville are the authors. Really, really important, policy changing work here. It's extensive. They have supplementals with all the documentation. And they found that even at very low intensities, there are impacts to animals, and all species studied, actually, there have been effects that have been documented. Broad range of effects, which ranges from impacts to orientation, migration, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, and survivorship. So quickly turning to pollinators, honeybees, there is a research base and evidence that it's found impacts to colony strength, homing ability, that's the ability to come home, the immune system, behavior, physiology, reproduction, and fertility, orientation, and the queen bee egg laying rate as well. This is documented not only in the Levitt et al. Papers, but also in a review done by Phil et al., Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields on Insects. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis. Another really important paper, they looked at non-ionizing both lower frequencies as well as wireless frequencies. And here I have, though, how yet we are being marketed cell phone cases to protect the phone with the bee on it, not technology that protects the bees and the pollinators. So it's beyond. My mind was blown when I saw these products, wildlife wireless products. We have the Amazon Echo and animal decorations, and even a cell phone case, which is a bee. You're probably familiar with this research from scientific reports that looked at exposures to insects and found that as they did simulations of insects exposed to 5G's higher frequencies and found that as the frequency got higher, the absorption rate increased. Not to a certain degree, there's a resonance, there's frequency range where there's a resonance effect, where the exposure becomes very intense to the insects. In fact, they found that exposures could increase the power, the absorbed power could increase between 3 to 370%. And the researchers concluded this could lead to changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology over time. Well, then these scientists, several of them did follow-up studies. And I'm going to talk about two important publications. One was the author's name is Geladze, and it looked at the honeybee and actually looked at the absorption into the brain and body tissue, first of its kind study, and found, again, as the earlier studies showed, that there is the resonance effect, and for different tissues and areas of the brain, as well as the body, that there are these frequency ranges where the level becomes so high. And you can see, I should have explained this, and I'm sorry, let me just do this really quick. So here you have 2 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz, 12 gigahertz, 24 gigahertz, where you see much more lighter color in the bee. So you have the same power level. It's the same level of intensity, but the frequency changed, and you get a different absorption into the insects, which are flying closer to all these antennas as well. Similarly, they did this with the bee body, but sort of looked at different aspects. They looked at the brain and body tissue specifically, and found these changes with the higher frequencies. And then they did not just the bee. This is another study by some of the authors. They did Geladze as well as Arno Thielens, who has been simulating insect exposures as well. And they did the ladybug and also the praying mantis. And they found that the absorption can rise sharply depending on several variables. There's the frequency, but as well there's peculiarities of the different insects, where the insect size and structure are important, and that there can be, like as an example, they looked at the cuticles, that's the hard outside of an insect, and found that it increased with frequency, so that the ladybug's cuticle rate rose from 0.1 watts per kilogram to 11.9 watts per kilogram. That's 119 times higher as the frequency went higher from 2.5 gigahertz all the way to 100 gigahertz. Now remember that the frequencies for 5G, this is just the beginning. Industry is testing for 6G and 7G, and they are looking at frequencies that go all the way to terahertz. So what we have now is just the beginning of where we're headed. And I know I have 5 minutes, and I'm going to use every last minute. So increase your distance to decrease your exposure. These images are from the International Commission for the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. They're a very important paper on exposure limits and engineering solutions. And you can see as the phone is distanced, there is less exposure. So it's the first thing to know is keep a distance, distance the phones and laptops away from your head and body. Don't keep them in your pocket and bra. Here's some tips to reduce exposure, especially if you're just starting out. Avoid placing devices on your laps, especially those of children, and during pregnancy. And don't use wireless earphones. That's on all the time. It is always transmitting. And also, you're then getting the phone, which is transmitting, and that device in your ear. Kids keep them in their ears all day, right? They're walking to and from classes with those in their ears. It's really better to use a wired headset and have the phone away from the body. Better yet, use airplane mode and master airplane mode, or don't have the phone on at all. Have some more time when that phone is off. So you do need to know airplane mode and how to turn your phone off. I cannot tell you how many people I know, I talk to them about this issue, they don't even know how to turn their phone off. So we need to learn how to do that, how to turn the antennas off. You turn airplane mode on, but now the technology's changed. You need to learn how to go into settings, make sure Bluetooth is off and Wi-Fi is off. There's a lot you can do. You can take pictures, videos. You can use applications that don't need the internet all the time. If you have to navigate and you don't have an old style GPS, which is what I have, you can get it all set up in your phone, then turn it on airplane mode with antennas off and navigate. You will still be able to get to where you're going, but you don't have to have the phone radiating at you all the time. So I told you about how France has this information already. In fact, many countries already have straightforward advice on cell phones. They say exposure to children should be minimized. And of course, prefer corded technology. Use Ethernet cords. Use corded phones, not cordless, and opt out of smart meters. One quick way, if you're new to this issue, is to create a sleep sanctuary. Just reduce your exposure at night and start out that way. Remove electronics from your bedroom. Turn your phone on airplane mode. Better yet, use a battery-powered alarm clock. Do not charge devices near your bed or head or body, or use them while they're charging, because then you're even getting more electromagnetic field radiation. Turn off routers and wireless devices and networks at night while you're sleeping. Clear all electrical cords out from under your bed. So I have a lot more to share, but I don't think I have the time to do it. Local governments, check. Do you have an ordinance about cell towers? Educate your policymakers on this issue. If they say their hands are tied, their hands are not tied. At the bare minimum, and there is a lot they can do more than this, they can write a letter to the federal government calling on them to have stronger regulations and to update their outdated 1996 limits. Advocate for safe technology at schools. The federal government has a lot to do. They have to update their limits. They need to have monitoring, enforcement, and oversight of the industry. And get this regulatory capture situation needs to be addressed. I just did a big filing to the FCC on this. Now, if you want to stay updated with us, please go to Environmental Health Sciences. There is a sign up there at ehsciences.org. Wireless Health Facts is the page. We are just getting our site up and going, but there is a way that you can sign up to be on our list. Please go sign up so that we can keep you informed of what we are up to, because we have a lot going on, and there's a really important page on what doctors and scientists say that I think you'll find as a really important resource. Thank you so much.
Perfect
I think I'm at
timing.
the
All right.
time.
Well, I have a lot of questions. Could you do me one quick favor? Can you put the slide with the sleep sanctuary back up? I just wanted to see that. If you're able to share that real quickly,
Sure.
like 2-3 slides back.
Sleep sanctuary.
Yeah, I'm like sending this stuff to my kids, and I want to make sure I'm getting it all. And you said even electrical wire is not under your bed?
You want to clear all wires, all electricity, That's a first step. There's actually a deeper dive we can go, but
Right. Yeah. All right. Well,
yeah, electricity.
great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all the information that you share with us. I really wish we had more time with you because I'd love to ask you some questions. If we can unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation for everything Theodora shared with us
Sure,
today.
and I'll be in the panel tonight, so.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great information.
Thank you.